Hi, and welcome to number 16 in the Child Study Press series on Chinese Australian history, among other things. And today, our friendly bots, are going to be discussing an article I wrote back in 2020 called Stopping Them Using Our Boats for the Australian Economic History Review. And what this is about is just a bit of a comparison or a bit of an historical idea of what Australia was doing to stop people entering by boats back in the early 20th century by and large. So a little bit different from the kind of palaver that goes on nowadays where they send the Navy out and try and stop someone floating in. Because, of course, in the early 20th century, there were no aeroplanes and people came by boat all the time. And that included people who were entering Australia in defiance of immigration, or more widely known in those days as the White Australia policy. And so this largely meant, of course, but not exclusively, but largely meant Chinese people, Chinese Australians or people of Chinese origin and heritage. And so the article will explain what that means in the historical context of that time and give some idea of what that means for the present. So I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We unpack complex topics, digging out those crucial bits of insight for you. Today we're looking at something that feels, well, surprisingly current, actually. Controlling who comes to an island continent.
Yeah, it really does echo, doesn't it?
Totally. Like stopping the boats now versus back in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
The language is similar, but back then, maybe the focus was even more on who was on the boats.
Exactly. And that's our mission today, sort of to dive into that period. Right after Australian Federation in 1901, we're going to explore how they set up these immigration restrictions and some of the pretty extreme, almost bizarre lengths they went to, especially targeting Chinese people trying to arrive by ship.
Right. So you'll get a real handle on this struggle that's often kind of overlooked, connecting those old policies to, the real people and how society was shaped. Our main source for this deep dive is an expert paper by Michael Williams called Stopping Them Using Our Boats. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. So, when they drafted the Immigration Restriction Act in 1901, the politicians, they probably thought, okay, island continent, this should be fairly simple to control. But as Michael Williams points out, it turned out to be way more complicated than they bargained for.
Why was that? What made it so tricky?
Well, a huge factor was that there was already a big established Chinese community here by 1901. It wasn't like starting from scratch.
That's a really key point, isn't it? They weren't dealing with a blank page.
Yeah.
How established are we talking?
Oh, very. Chinese people had been coming in fairly large numbers since the gold rushes, the 1850s. They built up these really strong networks, family ties, businesses, community groups, not just within Australia, across the colonies, but crucially linking back to their home villages in China, mostly the Pearl River Delta region.
Ah, right. The Pearl River Delta, known for migration.
Exactly. And links to places like Hong Kong and Shanghai, too. So it was this whole interconnected system already humming along before Federation even happened.
And the colonies themselves, they'd already been trying to restrict this, hadn't they, before 1901?
Yeah, that's right. This wasn't a brand new idea. Individual colonies had brought in their own rules, specifically aimed at the Chinese. Victoria started things off way back in 1855. New South Wales followed in 1861.
And what did those early rules look like?
Mostly focused on the ships. They brought in tonnage restrictions, basically limiting how many Chinese passengers a ship could carry based on its size. Like in NSW in 1861, it was 1 person per 10 tons. But by 1888, that jumped massively to 1 person per 300 tons.
Wow. Okay. That's a huge change.
Yeah, and poll taxes, too. Started at 10 pounds in 1881, but then got hiked up to 100 pounds in 1888. A really significant amount of money back then.
And they were already making the ship captains responsible.
Yep. Shipmasters, shipping agents, they were already liable if they broke the rules.
Yeah.
So that idea of putting the onus on the transport companies was there from quite early on.
Okay, so that sets the scene. Then comes Federation in 1901. Australia becomes a nation, sets up its first national bureaucracy. And those old colonial customs officers get rolled into this new Commonwealth system. And one of the very first big laws they pass is this Immigration Restriction Act.
That's the one.
And the fascinating thing, as you mentioned, is that the act itself, the text, it doesn't name any specific race or country.
No, it was deliberately coded. Imperial politeness, they called it. Britain didn't want to upset allies, particularly Japan.
But everyone knew who it was really aimed at.
Oh, absolutely. The overwhelming concern driving the whole thing was restricting Chinese immigration. And since most Chinese people arrived by ship, that's where the focus landed.
And these ships were the vital link.
Yeah.
You mentioned companies like the Eastern and Orient Line, Nippon Yusen Kaisha.
Yeah, and later the Australian Oriental Line, running ships like the Taiping, the Tanda, the Changte, they kept that connection to Asia going.
Were these big ships,
Yeah.
like the ones coming from Europe?
Actually, no, they were generally smaller. The Tanda, for instance, was about 7,000 tons, carried maybe 250 passengers. Compare that to, say, the Orion on the Europe run over 23,000 tons, carrying more than 1,000 people.
So different scale, but still a constant flow.
Definitely. In those first 20 years after Federation, you still had on average maybe 1,500 to 2,300 Chinese arrivals and departures via Hong Kong each year. So people were still moving back and forth.
Which meant the control had to happen at the ships. So paint a picture for us. How did that actually work on the ground? Or I guess on the water?
Right, so customs officers would board incoming ships, sometimes as far north as Thursday Island, right near PNG, and then follow the coast down, checking at ports like Sydney, Melbourne. They do a muster line everyone up, passengers and crew, check documents. And they'd search the ships pretty thoroughly, looking for smuggled goods, but also, hidden people.
And who got the most attention?
Unsurprisingly, it was non-Europeans, and especially anyone Chinese. They were under the microscope.
Okay, this is where we get to the core mechanism, isn't it? The dictation test. Sounds almost deceptively simple.
Deceptive is the right word. It became the absolute cornerstone of the restriction policy after about 1903. They dropped the earlier pretense that it was some kind of education test.
So how did it work? You had to write down 50 words dictated to you.
Yeah, 50 words in a European language. If you failed, you were declared a prohibited immigrant.
But here's the genius of it from their perspective, or the cruelty, depending how you look at it.
Go on.
The key wasn't just that you'd fail. I mean, they made sure you would. They'd give the test in a language they knew you had zero chance of knowing.
Like if you spoke Cantonese, they'd give you what?
Greek, or French,
Okay.
or Dutch. There's even mention of Scots Gaelic being used. It was deliberately chosen to be impossible.
Okay, so failure was guaranteed. But you said that wasn't the only key part. Right. The real leverage, the thing that made the system bite, was making the shipping companies responsible. If someone failed the test after arriving on their ship, the company got slapped with a massive 100-pound fine per person. Plus, they had to pay to take the person back where they came from.
Ah, I see. So the government basically made the shipping lines do the dirty work of screening people before they even got on the boat in Hong Kong or wherever.
Precisely. It shifted the enforcement burden upstream. The shipping companies didn't want those 100-pound fines, so they became incredibly strict about who they sold tickets to.
And it wasn't just about literacy, was it? It could be used politically, too. You mentioned the case of Kang Yue.
Yeah, he was a really interesting figure, a prominent Chinese reformist, an ex-royal from the imperial government. And the official Australian records, they actually show specific instructions being sent. If Kang turns up, and if he understands English, give him the dictation test in Spanish or Italian.
Wow. So black and white, they're saying, use this test to keep this specific person out for political reasons.
Exactly. It just blows away any idea that it was purely about education or fitting in. It was a tool, a weapon for exclusion.
So what effect did this have? Did lots of people end up taking the test and failing?
Well, this is the interesting part. Because the shipping companies started doing the screening, the number of people actually given the test once they got to Australia plummeted.
Really?
Yeah. In 1902, soon after it started, 653 people were tested. By 1904, that was down to 117. And by 1913, only 30 people were tested all year, and 27 of those were stowaways they had found.
So the threat of the test was enough?
Largely, yes. It acted as a deterrent much earlier in the process. The last recorded instance of a Chinese person being given the test on arrival wasn't until 1940, so it worked in its own, discriminatory way.
But people didn't just give up, did they? The Chinese community, they pushed back.
Absolutely not. And we need to understand why they kept trying. It wasn't just random individuals. It was tied into deep social and economic structures.
Tell us more about that. What was driving them?
Well, particularly for people from the Pearl River Delta, there is this really long history going back centuries, like the 12th century, of men leaving home to earn money overseas. It was often an established family strategy. Someone would go, send money back, support the family. Australia was seen as Gamsan Gold Mountain, or Sungamsan, New Gold Mountain, distinguishing it from California.
So it's part of their culture almost, this pattern of migration.
Very much so. And most men who came arrived already in debt. They borrowed money for their passage, perhaps. That shaped where they worked, how they lived. And they had these incredibly strong ties based on their home district, their dialect. That helped with everything, finding work, setting up businesses, sending money home, getting news. It facilitated chain migration.
So they weren't just breaking the law in their eyes. They were continuing a way of life,
Yeah.
maintaining these vital links.
You could definitely see it that way. They had strong reasons, family, community, economics, to keep those connections going, even with the new restrictions.
And some people already here had rights, didn't they? People who lived in Australia before 1901.
Yes, that's another crucial piece. If you were resident here before Federation, you were generally considered domiciled. You could get a document initially called a Certificate of Domicile, later a CEDT, certificate exempting from dictation tests.
And that let them travel.
Exactly. It allowed them to go back to China, visit family, maybe get married, and then return to Australia without needing to sit the test.
Were these commonly used?
Oh, very much so. The records suggest that out of about 10,000 Chinese people considered domiciled in New South Wales alone, something like 6,000 of them made at least one trip back to China and returned between 1901 and the 1950s.
Wow. So that certificate was incredibly valuable.
Hugely valuable. Which, of course, led to other things.
Right. Let's talk about the countermeasures. How did the community try to navigate or, well, get around this system?
They developed quite a few strategies for people who didn't have pre-1901 residency rights or couldn't get the paperwork sorted easily, especially if they didn't speak much English. They often relied on agents. These were often linked to prominent Chinese businesses, stores like Kwang Warfong in Hong Kong or Kwang Warchong here in Sydney.
And what did these agents do?
They'd help book the steamer tickets, navigate the forms, use their English skills and their standing as merchants to sort things out. We see cases in the archives, like a guy called Tarm Hugh in 1913, arguing there was a misunderstanding because someone else filled out his form for him.
So using intermediaries, what else? You mentioned the CVTs were valuable.
Which inevitably led to fraud. Because these documents were like gold, people would try to forge them or maybe pass off someone else's certificate as their own, birth certificates, naturalization papers too.
Were they successful?
Sometimes. There's a record of a man, Ah Xing, confessing he paid 25 nuns in Hong Kong a lot of money for fake NSW naturalization papers. And it wasn't just individuals trying it on. There were reports of corrupt officials sometimes being involved in supplying false documents, too.
Okay, so document fraud was one way. What about trying to bypass the system entirely, like on the ships themselves?
Yeah, that definitely happened. One way was desertion. Crew members on the ships would just disappear when the ship docked in Australia and melt into the community.
Like Ji Kwong or Lois Poi mentioned in the paper.
Exactly, and sometimes it ended tragically. There was a case, Chan Shi, who was caught after deserting, put back on his ship, and then apparently jumped overboard and was presumed drowned.
That's grim. Was desertion common?
Reasonably so. NSW was apparently seen as a bit of a hotspot for it, maybe because ships stayed in port longer, and the larger Chinese communities in places like Sydney made it easier to hide.
And then there were stowaways. That sounds incredibly dangerous.
Extremely dangerous, but it was a significant way people got in after 1901. We know that between 1926 and 1929 alone, 400 stowaways were caught and deported just from Sydney, so the actual number getting through was likely higher.
Was it organized?
It seems like it often was. It wasn't just individuals randomly hiding. There are accounts suggesting organized efforts involving crew members, planning in Hong Kong, contacts in Sydney ready to meet them. They'd hide in horrendous places, coal bunkers, water tanks, often helped by Chinese passengers who were traveling legally with CEDs, suggesting the returnees knew what was going on.
The conditions must have been awful.
Terrible. People were found dead or so weak from the journey they couldn't even get off the ship when it arrived. It was incredibly risky.
Was there money involved in this too, like a smuggling business?
Yes, definitely. A customs report from 1908 described it as an organized business. The cost might be around £80 again, a huge sum. Often, it seems the cost was split, part paid to a shipper in Hong Kong, part to an assistant or contact in Australia. The crew involved might get half their payment when leaving Hong Kong, and the rest only once the stowaway landed safely.
How do they guarantee payment?
Sometimes the stowaway would have to sign a promissory note, maybe stamped by a trusted storekeeper in the community, before they were let go by the smugglers here. It was quite sophisticated, really.
Amidst all this, what about the wider community? Did people help those who got caught?
Yes, there was strong community support. People would often put up large bonds, £100 or even more, to bail out individuals who were detained or facing deportation while their cases were investigated.
Like the example of George Gay and Li Bengyi?
That's an amazing one. In 1923, they apparently paid £1,000, an absolutely enormous sum, as bond for 20 people facing deportation. It shows a real level of collective responsibility.
But it wasn't all solidarity, was it? There was a darker side with informers.
Unfortunately, yes. Customs officials sometimes paid rewards, maybe £10, for information leading to the capture of illegal immigrants or deserters. Sometimes this seems to have been driven by rivalries between different groups or syndicates involved in migration or smuggling. There's a case mentioned, Lee Fook, who lived here undetected for 15 years before being caught based on certain information. He was deported.
So a really complex picture of resistance, risk, community support, and sometimes betrayal.
Exactly. And in response to all this, the officials just kept tightening the screws.
How so? What do they do?
More searches, more musters of passengers and crew, scrutinizing documents even more closely, demanding witnesses to verify identities. They even started conducting investigations back in Hong Kong and China, and they kept amending the law. The Immigration Restriction Act became just the Immigration Act in 1912, giving officials more power.
More power than the police, even.
In some respects, yes. Customs officers gained quite broad powers to enter and search premises if they suspected breaches of the Immigration Act, arguably exceeding police powers at the time.
And these investigations, they revealed more about the money involved.
Yeah, reports from inspectors like Lewis in 1907 and Gabriel in 1912 give figures for illegal entry anywhere from £70 up to £105, sometimes quoted in Hong Kong dollars, like $1,200 from the Sincere syndicate, usually paid by family already here, to the organizers or handlers.
But even with all these efforts, the original tool, the dictation test, just became, well, kind of weird, didn't it? Some real bureaucratic quirks.
Oh, definitely. The whole thing took on a life of its own. Like, for years, the actual instruction to give the test wasn't always clear. Sometimes it was verbal, or they avoided sending telegrams about it. Officially, it was often just referred to by its section in the Act, like, apply para A of S.3. Imagine getting that instruction. Must have been confusing.
Like a secret code. And what about the test passages themselves? You said no one passed after 1909.
That's right. Yet, believe it or not, they kept issuing new sets of dictation test passages every fortnight, later every 6 months, for almost 30 years.
Why? If no one could pass anyway.
The official reason was to prevent people from somehow learning the passages by heart, even though everyone knew passing was impossible. It's just peak bureaucracy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Keep the machine running, even when its original purpose is long gone.
Maintaining the facade.
Totally. And immigration forums kept a column for pass the dictation test for decades afterwards, too.
And the language thing was weird, too. It changed to any prescribed language at one point.
Yeah, in 1905, that was supposedly a concession to Japan, who protested the European language rule. So the law said any prescribed language.
Okay, so which languages did they prescribe?
None. They never actually prescribed any language, so in practice it just stayed any European language.
And they didn't even have standard tests ready in those languages?
Nope. No official passages were ever written in French or Greek or whatever. If they needed to give the test in another language, they had to rely on customs officers who happened to speak it, or hire interpreters, or apparently even sometimes grab the local Greek fruit shop owner, pay him 10 shillings and sixpence, and get him to translate something on the spot.
That is genuinely absurd. It sounds like a farce.
It really highlights the arbitrary, almost make-it-up-as-you-go nature of the enforcement sometimes.
Then there was the whole challenge of identifying people correctly, especially those claiming pre-1901 residency, or students, or even Australian-born Chinese citizens returning from trips.
Yeah, verifying documents like CEDTs, birth certificates, passports became a huge focus, which led to some pretty extreme measures.
Like biometrics.
Yes, they started taking fingerprints, even handprints, even of babies, apparently, which seems incredibly invasive.
And they tried using x-rays.
Yeah, that was a weird one. After World War I, they had this idea they could x-ray people's bones, look at the ossification, how fused the bones were to judge their age. They hoped it would help catch people falsely claiming they were old enough to have been here before 1901, but it didn't really work. It proved unreliable.
Just grasping at straws, it sounds like.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the level of suspicion was intense. Even Australian-born citizens of Chinese background, if they came back from a trip to China and maybe didn't speak fluent English, they faced huge hurdle.
Their own passports weren't enough.
Often not. Their documents were treated with suspicion. Officials might demand to interview their mothers, who were often non-Chinese, or other witnesses to confirm their identity and birth in Australia. It could lead to these really long, drawn-out investigations for people who were legally citizens.
It just shows how deeply ingrained the suspicion was, based purely on ethnicity.
Absolutely.
So, looking at the big picture, what was the long-term result of the dictation test and the whole white Australia policy it enforced?
Well, demographically, it had a massive impact. The Chinese population in Australia just shrank dramatically, from around 30,000 at the time of Federation down to only about 9,000 by 1947. So in terms of its stated aim of reducing the non-European population, it was brutally effective.
And it changed the nature of the community that remained, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned two distinct groups forming.
Yeah, you ended up with, on one hand, this aging group of men, mostly, who had arrived before 1901, often working as market gardeners, maybe had wives back in China they visited using their CADTs, but couldn't become citizens themselves. Their numbers were dwindling. And on the other hand, you had a smaller but slowly growing community of Australian-born Chinese, people born here, citizens, but still facing that suspicion we talked about.
And the age profile shifted dramatically.
Definitely. By the 1920s, the average Chinese man in NSW was middle-aged, in his 40s or 50s. By the 1940s, if officials saw a young Chinese man arriving, that in itself might raise red flags. There's a statistic, I think from 1929, a ship called the Arafura arrived, and out of 58 Chinese passengers, only 6 were under 50 years old.
Wow. That really paints a picture of an aging, restricted community.
It does, but importantly, the community wasn't wiped out. Despite everything, there was a slow revival.
How did that happen, even with the test still in place?
Well, partly through the natural increase of that Australian-born population. Their numbers went from maybe 1,500 in 1911 to over 3,700 by 1947. Plus, there was a small trickle of new arrivals allowed in under temporary permits, certificates of exemption. Some of those managed to stay, maybe 3,500 stayed permanently by 1947. And then after World War II, you start getting refugees as well.
So resilience again. The community found ways to persist.
Absolutely. And meanwhile, the dictation test itself was becoming, well, a bit of an embarrassment internationally.
How so?
There were high-profile cases where it was used in ways that caused political problems. The Egon Kisch affair in the 1930s was a big one. He was a European anti-fascist writer they wanted to keep out. Using the dictation test on him caused a huge stink.
Right, because he was European.
Exactly. And then it was used against a British woman, Mrs. Freer, who they also wanted to exclude for perceived moral reasons. These cases really highlighted how arbitrary and politically motivated the test could be, and it didn't look good for Australia on the world stage.
So it started to lose its usefulness, or at least its political cover.
Yeah, it became increasingly awkward. It was used less and less through the 1950s. The last time ever was apparently 1953. And then finally, in 1958, it was formally abolished. The immigration minister at the time, Alexander Downer, the father of the more recent politician, called it, I get this right, an archaic, heavy-handed piece of machinery quite out of keeping with modern ideas, and admitted it had tarnished Australia's good name.
A pretty damning assessment from the government itself.
By that point, yes. And of course, the white Australia policy took longer to dismantle. That really happened through the 60s and was finally abolished in the 1970s.
So wrapping this up, it's been a fascinating look at how this attempt to essentially engineer a racially homogenous nation played out. This whole complex system of restrictions, the dictation test, the bureaucratic absurdities.
Yeah, driven by that vision of a white Australia. But what's just as striking is the other side, the sheer persistence and ingenuity of the Chinese communities, maintaining those deep family and economic ties against the odds, developing all those counter strategies, from using agents to the dangers of stowing away. It really was this constant push and pull.
A dynamic struggle. Like the paper says, every official move met with a counter move from the community, leading to all that secrecy, fraud, the suspicion, and obviously a lot of personal hardship for the people involved.
Definitely.
This deep dive, I think, really shows that controlling borders, this whole idea of stopping the boats, it's never just been about laws on paper. It's always this messy interaction between the legal stuff, how it's actually applied by bureaucrats on the ground, and, well, the basic human drives for family, for opportunity, for connection.
That's a great summary.
And maybe a final thought to leave people with. What does this long history, this century-long story of adaptation and resistance against a seemingly powerful state apparatus, what does it really tell us about the limits of trying to control human movement and connection through laws alone? especially when those deep motivations and community ties are involved.
That's the enduring question, isn't it? Something that history keeps asking us.
Well, thank you very much to our friendly bots. I think you discussed that very well. As you can see, if you wish to read that, of course, go to Chinese Australian History on 88 Objects and look under About. You'll see my list of publications, or go to the show notes in wherever you're listening to this podcast, whether it's on YouTube or Podbean or Apple Podcasts. I'll have a link to the original journal article, or if you can't access it, email me at chidestudypress@gmail.com and I can send you a copy or a summary. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed listening to this discussion of how Australia handled people coming by boat in the early 20th century, what that meant for people, mainly of Chinese heritage, their links with their villages, what Australia policy meant to them, and how this was dealt with in a range of ways, sometimes farcical, as of course it is even today. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for listening.